Amen. Good morning. Thank you, choir. They were amazing. Let's give them a hand. That was great worship this morning. Just thankful to be in a place where we can just freely worship God like that. My name is Jason. If you don't know me, I'm Jason. I'm the youth and young adult pastor here at Woodburn Baptist. I know I'm not Tim. It's like coming to see Dolly Parton and getting me. It's not the same. But I appreciate the opportunity to come and share with you guys, and for Tim and giving me the opportunity to do that. We're going to be just looking at God's word this morning and just trying to figure out what he's telling us. It's just as simple as that, and so we're going to do this together. This time of year, I thought it was going to be rainy. It's a little cloudy this morning, but the last couple weeks have been pretty amazing, right? I know we need the rain probably, but just those days of sunshine and the beautiful crisp but not super cold, but just cold enough air. It's my favorite time of year. I love like September through the end of the year. You have things to do outside, and you have the weather, of course, and you have things to look forward to. You have the holidays coming, so all that stuff, and I love that. Two things I don't love about this time of year is the allergies that come along with that. That's just annoying. But every so often, like this year, it's an election year, right? Now, we're not talking politics, but that's just something that we hear about a lot, kind of this time of year, every few years. And we don't usually think about the process of how laws are made on a daily basis. But if you remember back, several years ago, Schoolhouse Rock, remember that show if you're a kid? Yeah. I'm Just a Bill, the song, kind of taught the process, the basic process of how a bill became a law and all that stuff. Essentially, it has to pass through a couple chambers and the Senate and the House and all that and be signed off on by the president. Now, I know there's a lot of stuff in between, but that's the basic kind of principles of how a law is made or a law is changed. Now, for those that present these new laws or these changes, there's not a lot riding on it other than maybe their reputation if it doesn't pass, or maybe even career. It could be some career stuff that goes on if it doesn't go the way they want. But essentially, they'll go home and continue to live their life whether it passes or not. Now, you contrast that with ancient Greece. Ancient Greeks did not mess around with stuff. And so their process was in a specific area called Locris. And they had this process of where if someone wanted to present a new law, or to change an existing law, they were to go before the council of 1,000. And they were to be standing on some kind of pedestal that can be removed with a rope around their neck. So essentially, if it passes, okay, that's good. But if it didn't, the penalty would be death. So for a period of 200 years, only one law was changed. And you can imagine that it had to be serious. You had to be committed, and today we have since January, since the current Congress has been in session since January of 21, there's been like 175 laws that have been passed. It's quite different, right? Because essentially there's a little bit of commitment, but you don't have to have both feet out there. You can keep one foot safe and one foot out there, and you're okay. But the Greeks, it was all or nothing. There was no safety net. They had to be fully committed to this idea, whatever this law was, whatever this change was that they were presenting. They had to be completely and fully committed to that in order for them to put their life on the line, right? So we're going to be looking at a familiar story. You can go ahead and turn there. It's Daniel chapter 3. Starting in verse 8, but as you're turning, I want you to think about all the commitments that you have in your life that you would consider commitments. And the question, I guess, that we're going to start with is how are we fully committed to each of these things, or each of these people, if it's people that you've listed in your mind? Or are there varying levels or degrees of commitment that we might have? And if so, that begs the question, I guess, how do you determine what to commit to first, or who to commit to first? So that's what we're going to pick up today. Daniel chapter 3, let's read it together, starting in verse 8. Some of these Chaldeans went to the king and informed the Jews. They said to the king, Nebuchadnezzar, long live the king. You issued a decree requiring all the people to bow down and worship the gold statue when they hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipes, and other musical instruments. That decree also states that those who refuse to obey must be thrown into a blazing furnace. But there are some Jews, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, whom you have put in charge of the province of Babylon. They pay no attention to you, your majesty. They refuse to serve your gods and do not worship the gold statue you've set up. Then Nebuchadnezzar flew into a rage and ordered that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be brought before him. And then when they were brought in, Nebuchadnezzar said to them, Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you refuse to serve my gods or worship the gold statue I've set up? I will give you one more chance to bow down and worship the statue I've made when you hear the sound of the musical instruments. But if you refuse, you'll be thrown immediately into the blazing furnace, and then what God will be able to rescue you from my power?" Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to save us. He will rescue us from your power, your majesty. But even if he doesn't, we want to make it clear to you, your majesty, that we will never serve your gods or worship the gold statue you have set up." Verse 19, Nebuchadnezzar was so furious that his face became distorted with rage. He commanded that the furnace be heated 7 times hotter than usual. Then he ordered some of the strongest men of his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and throw them into the blazing furnace. So they tied them up, threw them into the furnace, fully dressed in their pants, turbans, robes, and other garments. And because the king in his anger had demanded such a hot flame in the furnace, the fires killed the soldiers as they threw the 3 men in. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, securely tied, fell into the roaring flames. But suddenly Nebuchadnezzar jumped up in amazement and exclaimed to his advisors, "Didn't we tie up 3 men and throw them into the furnace?" "Well, yes, your majesty, we certainly did." "Look," Nebuchadnezzar shouted, "I see 4 men unbound, walking around in the fire unharmed, and the 4th looks like a god." Then Nebuchadnezzar came as close as he could to the door of the flaming furnace and shouted, "Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out, come here." So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego stepped out of the fire. Then the high officers, officials, governors, advisors, they crowded around them and saw that the fire had not touched them. Not a hair on their heads was singed, and their clothing was not scorched. They didn't even smell of smoke. Then Nebuchadnezzar said, "Praise to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He sent his angel to rescue his servants who trusted in him. They defied the king's command and were willing to die rather than serve or worship any god except their own. Therefore, I make this decree. If any people, whatever their race or nation or language, speak a word against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they will be torn limb from limb, and their houses will be turned into heaps of rubble. There are no other gods who can rescue like this." Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to even higher positions in the province of Babylon. Let's pray. God, we just come to you this morning just asking for your wisdom. We just pray right now that you please just bind Satan from this room. I pray that you get rid of distractions and things that might be on our minds as we're thinking about lunch or thinking about this week. I pray that you just push that back and let us just hear from you this morning, God. Just speak to each and every heart that's in this room and listening by way of radio or internet. God, we love you, we praise you, and we ask these things in your son's name. Amen. Now, I know I dropped you kind of in the middle of the story. You're all probably familiar with what's going on. But at this point, of course, Nebuchadnezzar has taken these young men from Judah, taken them captive, kind of trained them. He wanted the strongest, the brightest, and that kind of thing. So he took them from their home, and he's now got them in Babylon. And he's trained them up and put them in positions of kind of authority, places that he wants. And he's kind of gotten a big head, right? And so he's created this giant statue that he wants everyone to bow down to as soon as they hear the music play. And he sent this message out far and wide so that everybody knew this was the law, this was not a suggestion, this is what you had to do. And so now we're here with these guys who had made a decision that they were not going to bow down to this. They had to decide whether they were going to stay committed to God or whether they were going to turn their back on him and compromise by bowing down to this idol. And of course, they knew the consequences. They knew that they were real. They knew they were dangerous. So the question these guys really had to answer was, do I stay committed to God and die? Or do I compromise and live? And there's a misnomer that's going around that if you are a follower of Christ, that your life will be free of conflict. And if you're a believer in this room and you've been a believer for a period of time, you know that that's not true, right? Believers are not exempt from conflict. A committed life will be marked with times of conflict. That's just the reality of the sinful world that we live in. Jesus reminds us this in John 16. He says, "Here on this earth you will have many trials and sorrows." We will have conflict. So what I want us to look at this morning is the concept of commitment to God. When life offers us so much and so many amazing things, so many amazing people, we can become so overwhelmed that we begin maybe to question, okay, what am I supposed to be committed to today? What am I committed to today? What am I committed to tomorrow? And we need to remind ourselves why God should be first to receive our full and total commitment. And there are countless things and people that you can commit to. And if you're honest, if I asked everyone in this room, where your commitments lie, you would probably mention God maybe in a list. He would be within that list, hopefully maybe toward the top, and maybe he would be your number one. But if he's not, I ask you, how's that working out for you? I heard a story of Luciano Pavarotti. Pavarotti, I'm not sure exactly how to pronounce that, but he was a famous opera singer, classical musician. He passed away just a few years back, but a famous tenor, singing tenor. And his father was a baker as he grew up. His father knew that he enjoyed music and was good at it, and so he encouraged him to kind of pursue that and to train in music. And so he encouraged him to develop his voice. And as Luciano grew up, he, of course, enjoyed music, but he also kind of had a heart for teaching. He actually enrolled in school to become a teacher. And his father sat down with him and said, listen, you've got to determine what it is you want to do. And he said, if you sit on two chairs, you're going to fall between them. You must choose one chair. So Luciano, obviously we know he chose singing, and he said it took him 7 years to get his first professional gig, I guess you would call it, and it took him another 7 years to make it to the Metropolitan Opera. He had to work hard and long to get where he wanted to get. And so he said this in an interview. He said, and now I think whether it's laying bricks, writing a book, or whatever you choose, we should give ourselves to it. Commitment, that's the key. You choose one chair. And so when it comes to commitment, you do have to make a choice. It doesn't mean that you can't love a lot of things, you can't be involved in a lot of things, and you can't pour yourself into a lot of things, but you need to choose what you're going to commit to first, or you're going to spread yourself out so thin. So, and so we get to this question of who or what should come first, right? Who is it? Anybody? Jesus, God, yeah, it's Jesus. Sunday school answer. It's Jesus, and I know it's simple to say, and it's simple to, yes, we're in church, we know it's Jesus, check that off, we're going to go home now. But there's a reality of the world that we live in that's so full of sin, that makes this not so cut and dry, and it makes it difficult to navigate. And so you might ask yourself, out of everything that I have in my life, I have some amazing people in my life, my family, my friends, I have some amazing opportunities, I have a career that I love, I have passions and hobbies that I love that I'm good at, and how or why should God come first? And the truth is, we can make this as complex as we wanted, but the reality is, it's simple. It's this, that we commit to God first because he's worthy. We commit to him first because he's worthy. These three guys, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, never forgot who God was in their life. Now, they knew what God was capable of. Their life was full of ups and downs, right? They remembered God first, and that he was worthy to commit their life to no matter what was to come. And whatever or wherever life would take them, even places beyond their control, away from their family, away from their friends, and in a new land with no one and no support, they knew that God was worthy of their full and total commitment. And if we want to be fulfilled in this life, then we need to seek the one who does the fulfilling. And the thing is, our commitment, which God requires and God asks us to be committed, but our commitment is not what fulfills us. It's the object of our commitment, right? Who does the fulfilling, who we are committed to. And we can be committed to a lot of amazing people and a lot of amazing things and even great things, but they will never fulfill us in a way that God can, that is sustaining. And it might be fun, it might be enjoyable, it might be some great causes, but they will never fulfill us the way that God can. That is satisfying and sustaining, but God can and God will, because he is worthy. And there's a few reasons that we know he is worthy. For one, he's a personal God. He's very personal, right? Philippians 4:19 says, the same God who takes care of me will supply all your needs from his glorious riches, which are given to us in Christ Jesus. He supplies our needs. He's personal. He knows what you need. He's sovereign. Colossians 1:17, he existed before anything else and holds all creation in his hands. He's faithful. I love this passage. Lamentations 3:22 and 23. The faithful love of the Lord never ends. His mercies never cease. Great is his faithfulness. His mercies begin fresh every day. He's faithful. And he's for us. He's for you. Romans 8:28, we know that God causes everything to work together for the good of those who love him and are called according to his purposes. He loves you and he wants the best for you. What else in this world is capable of these things? Nothing. No one. He alone is worthy of our first commitment. And that can start today. And what I want to challenge you as we walk through this together is determining where your, first commitment lies, where your real, true commitment lies. And if that's not on God, let's be honest with ourselves this morning. Only you know that. But if it's not with God, let's figure out how to make that shift to God. We tend to think about our relationship with God when things get difficult, right? When things are tough, when things aren't, just going the way we hope. That's when we begin to think about God. And as we can learn from these guys, then that's not the time to begin to commit to God, right? We need to be committed to God before that. We shouldn't wait for things to get difficult before we shift our commitment to God. The thing is, we need to commit to God now in the normal so that we can recognize him in the abnormal. Does that make sense? Commit to God now in the normal so that we can recognize him in the abnormal. Initially, these guys might have thought, okay, if I refuse to initially bow down, maybe people won't find out. They may not find out. Or if they do, maybe my position of authority will grant me some cushion, grant me some favor. So they knew there were consequences, but they might have thought, okay, maybe I can slip by without getting in too much trouble if I don't bow down. But when Nebuchadnezzar brought them before him and he was screaming at them, demanding that they change their minds, he's going to give them one more chance, they had now an immediate choice to make in the heat of the moment with real consequences. With real consequences, life or death. Now these guys, as we've seen, have been committed to God. They're fully committed to him. And they had been instinctively following him, and they continued that. They didn't just decide on this day to follow God, right? Long before Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego had faced these pressures of staying committed and facing death, they had to determine how they were going to respond when their core convictions were challenged. For us, just like these young men, this type of response doesn't just happen, suddenly and immediately on the spot. It's an overflow of an intimate relationship that we have with Jesus. And the decision to be fully committed to God can be made easier when it's made out of that overflow of that relationship that we have with him, rather than when you're just suddenly facing a fire and you have to make a split-second decision. Best time to learn how to put out a fire is when, right? Before the fire's ever started. That's why firefighters train for years to understand fire and how it works and the different kinds, and so that they know when they're face to face with a blazing furnace and have to make split-second decisions, they know how to respond appropriately. It becomes second nature to them. You probably don't know this about me, but I love to ride motorcycles and four-wheelers. I haven't been able to do that as much since I've moved here and live in a subdivision. There's just not places to do that. But I grew up on those, and that's just, I just spent hours every time I was awake. If I was awake, I was outside on a four-wheeler or a motorcycle. But we had this one four-wheeler that I just rode the wheels off this thing, and I was so comfortable on it. It kind of was an extension of myself. I knew it so well, and because I rode it so much and so hard, it very rarely had working brakes. I kept my dad busy. But it was him putting the brakes on. I sat there and watched, but putting the brakes on this thing all the time, and so essentially most of the time it was without brakes. And so I learned how this four-wheeler would respond when it didn't have the brakes, when I needed to do something with it. I learned in normal kind of everyday conditions how it would respond, so that when those split-second decisions came, when I was speeding through the trees on a trail and I had to stop or I had to make a sudden change, I knew how it would respond instinctively because I had spent so much time committed to this machine. And I didn't just hope that it would work out when I was pressured. I knew it. I knew how it was going to work. And so we spend time committing to God, building our relationship every day in the normal, so that when things become abnormal, we're faced with a decision, we know where he's going to lead us. We can hear him. We can recognize him. You learn how to follow him on those normal days so that you become familiar with his voice on those abnormal days. So that when you're face to face with tough situations and maybe a split-second decision, you're going to know him so well, you're going to recognize what he's saying and how he's saying it and what to do. And then, of course, if you spend enough time with God, you're going to know instinctively what he would like you to do. Everyone in this room probably has friends or family that you're super close with, and you know them so well that you know what they're going to say when a situation arises. You know what they would say. You know how they would react because you know them so well. You've spent time committed to that person and to that relationship. When you do that with God, you spend time with him, committed to him on the everyday, normal days. When something tough comes along, you're going to instinctively know what it is that he would do, and you can respond accordingly. So when those things pop up, you're ready. And so that might make sense to hopefully everyone in this room. You're thinking, okay, we know how to prepare, be committed to God now so that we can prepare for those split-second decisions. But what if it's a decision, maybe that's a long-range decision, and you have time to mull it over, and you question yourself about 400 times? Or what if it's maybe just not really cut and dry? Maybe there's consequences that you're not comfortable with, that you just don't really like, right? What do I choose then? What if my commitment to God will cause me to suffer? What if my commitment to God goes against everything the world is telling me? What if my commitment to God requires my kids to face some consequences? Well, I wish I could tell you there's a fancy formula, but there's not. The truth is simple, and it's this, that we commit to obeying God regardless of the outcome. We commit to obeying God regardless of the outcome. That's where faith comes in, right? That's where we have to have faith and have that developed and tested, because as humans, we love to know what's going to happen before it happens so that we can make a decision. We want to have all the information. But sometimes that's just not possible. And so when God calls us to do something, he wants us just to follow him. He doesn't want us to say, okay, God, I will follow you. Let me work it out A to Z, and then I'll follow you. No, he just says, come follow me. That's all. He just asks or requires really our commitment before the outcome is realized. Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego all had this decision to make, right? They had already decided at this point not to bow down, and they were arrested. And so now in verse 13, we see he's in a rage. He's screaming at them, yelling at them. And he's already placed these guys in a position of authority, and that probably embarrassed him that these guys were disobeying him. So he gives them another chance to try to save face. And he tells them they have the opportunity to make it right. Get out of trouble if they choose now to do what he initially wanted them to do. And now, if you think about being in this kind of situation, there were probably a lot of excuses that could have been made that essentially would be justifiable, right? They could have said, okay, well, we'll bow down, but we're not really going to worship. He won't know what our heart is saying. Or we'll bow down and ask God to forgive us. He'll forgive us. He knows what kind of situation we're in. Or this guy's our boss. God's going to understand we have to do what our boss says. Or maybe they're thinking, okay, well, these other guys have done things a lot worse than this, and they've been forgiven, so I'm okay, and nobody is going to be hurt by this. The list goes on. We could make up all kinds of excuses, and they're logical, right? And they sound, okay, we can talk ourselves into a lot of things. Any of these might have been justifiable in their eyes, or in a lot of people's eyes, to break or bend their commitment to God. They even acknowledged the fact that in verse 16, they said, Nebuchadnezzar, we don't need to defend ourselves before you. If you throw us in, God's capable of saving us and rescuing us. But the best part, in verse 18, they said, but even if he doesn't, we want to make it clear to you, we're not going to bow down. We want to make this clear. Even if he doesn't rescue us, that's real commitment. It reminds me of those ancient Greeks. That's real commitment. If you believed in this with all of your heart and you had to present this new law, it was all or nothing, right? See, these guys, they didn't know that God would rescue them in the way that he did. They didn't know how. They didn't know what that would look like. They knew that God was in control and he would take care of them, but they didn't know what that would look like. I'm sure they were hopeful that he would save them, but there's no way they could have imagined it would have been in the way that it happened. And so that's real commitment. They know that he's capable. They know he doesn't always rescue in the way that we think and the way that our minds can fathom. God doesn't always resolve things the way that we feel like it should be done, but we still commit to him and his outcome. So they were committed to God no matter the outcome. And then that's that whole process of faith being tested, right? True commitment obeys God regardless of the outcome. So yes, your decision to remain fully committed to God might cost you something. It probably will cost you something, maybe multiple things. That's just the reality of the sinful world that we live in. That's the reality of our world. We can't avoid that. And so it might mean that you or your family or your friends or your children might have to miss something in order for you to remain committed to God. But the awesome thing about God is this: he doesn't always just leave it there. The flip side of that is that your full commitment to God will also allow God to do more in your life than you could ever imagine. This is where it really gets good. We usually end this story here, and let's look at the rest of it. Though the king, he's of course so infuriated that they didn't decide to change their mind and follow him, that he said, I'm gonna heat this thing up really hot, 7 times hotter than usual. And then he ordered them to be tied up and thrown in as if the fire's not enough. He ties them up. And it's so hot, of course, that the guards that are throwing them in from a distance killed them. And so then the king, of course, he's surprised. He looks in, he sees 4 people. They're not tied up anymore. They're walking around. You know, what man can bind, God can undo. That's a whole nother sermon, but that's pretty amazing. But he's confused. He calls them to come out, and he says, come on out here. And I want to see what's going on. And of course, they come out. They're perfectly safe. They weren't burned at all. They didn't even smell like smoke, which is ridiculously amazing. And if that's not amazing enough, it even gets better. So he is so touched by their faith and their commitment to God that he says, I'm going to make a decree. No one will ever speak negatively about your God again from this point on. And he promoted them to higher positions, more responsibility, more influence. God did more in their life through their commitment than he could have ever done had they compromised, right? They might have been saved physically if they had decided, okay, yeah, I'll bow down and compromise here. But the king and these men never would have witnessed this amazing thing that God did, right? They would not have had that testimony moving forward. And now, of course, these guys are in positions that they would not have had. They may have been demoted because they had initially, disobeyed, but now they were promoted to a higher position where they might have an impact on countless people and be able to share God's word with these people, share what God just did with them. What an amazing story to share. These weren't results that they had asked for or even imagined. When you commit to God, he's going to do more in your life than you could ever dream of. I grew up in a small community very similar to Woodburn. We just weren't in proximity to a bigger town, but our church was smaller than Woodburn, but it's very similar in the feel. And my parents were just dedicated to the church from before me. And so as I grew up as a child, I was just in the church all the time. I gave my life to Jesus as I was 7 years old. But it really wasn't until I was about 13 when I began to understand that I needed to build a relationship with him. I knew that Jesus had saved me, but I didn't move past that infant stage. I didn't understand the relationship part. So it was then that I began to commit to God and to begin to build a relationship with him. And as I did that, God began to open doors for me to serve in church, even as a young teenager. And I helped with kids. I began being involved in music and worship, and I eventually began leading worship and leading the choir as a teenager. And I loved serving. I loved being a part of that. And so at the age of 17, I began to struggle with a call to ministry, what turned out as a call to ministry. I didn't really understand it at the time. At that time, I only understood that a full-time minister would have to be a pastor. I didn't know you could do other areas of ministry as a career. And so I was like, God, I don't know about being a pastor, so you're gonna have to do some convincing. And I really struggled with this. And so here's what I was doing. I was laying it all out. Well, here's what I enjoy. Here's where I could be in 5 years. Here's where I could be in 10 years. How is this going to work? What are you going to do with me, God? And how is this going to pan out? I wanted to plan it all out and figure it all out before I was going to commit. And so I struggled with this for several months before I realized I don't need to know where I'm going to be in 5 years or 10 years to commit to God now. He's going to take care of all that, and I just need to follow him, right? And so the reason that I knew that I could do that and I could trust him was that I had spent the last 4 years from the time I was 13 building that relationship. I had been committed to him, learning how he spoke to me, learning how he would reveal himself in trials and tribulations, and I learned that, okay, I can trust God with my life. I can trust him with this calling and with this decision. And so I submitted to and I committed to that call of ministry. And I remember telling God when I did this that, okay, I don't know what this is going to look like, but I'm just going to follow you, God. I'm going to follow you into ministry, whatever that looks like for me. And so from that moment on, doors began to open, doors that I never even knew existed in the first place. Have opportunity to teach students. I had opportunity to pursue a degree in worship. I had things I had never even thought of were happening in my life. And as time went on and as the years went by, God continues to open doors and windows and things in my life that I never even thought of 5 years prior, that was a possibility or if that was in existence. I have seen and experienced things in my life that I never could have imagined because I chose to be committed. I'm not perfect by any stretch. I fail every day, but I know that God will do and take care of everything in my life if I just continue that commitment to him. Now, again, my life has not been conflict-free. I've had struggles, but I've learned through those struggles, whether they're big or small, more and more how to lean on God and trust in that commitment to him. I would not have experienced the things that I've experienced. I probably wouldn't be here, standing here today, if I had compromised and if I had not been as fully committed to God in my life. We have this fear of commitment because we're afraid that if we commit to this, then what am I going to miss out on? Or what if it costs me something? But we need to trust the one who knows us better than we know ourselves, right? That's not how it works. True commitment comes before that outcome is realized. True commitment comes now, because the reality is God is so much bigger than whatever future we can imagine. Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, they all had committed their lives to God long before these events took place, right? And they had built a relationship with God, and they knew that he would take care of them. They didn't know how, they just knew that he would. And so they decided to be fully committed to him no matter what life threw at them. And even when they faced death, they said, even if God doesn't rescue us, we are never going to bow down. We are never going to compromise. You see, God is worthy of our commitment first, our full and total commitment. And now is the time, there's no better time than now, to begin to give him your full commitment, no matter what the outcome might be, no matter what the cost might be. Because the truth is, when you give God your commitment, he will be faithful to move in your life and to move through your life in ways that you never dreamed of. So the question for you all this morning is, what are you committed to first? If it's not God, if he's not your first and full commitment, then you need to reevaluate. We need to reevaluate. This doesn't mean that the people sitting around you, the people that you have in your life are not important and that they're not priorities, because they are. But God comes first. It doesn't mean that your job and your other responsibilities are not important or not worthy of your commitment, because they are. But it's being committed to God first so that you can love those people the way they need to be loved. It's being committed to God first so that you can do the job in the way that God has created you to do it, the best of the best. You commit to God first to give him everything, and he will give you everything you need to fulfill your responsibilities. He'll give you everything you need to show people how to love. He'll give you everything you need to navigate the life that's put before you. So before you can be the best dad or best mom or best son or daughter, before you can be the best accountant, the best realtor or farmer or waiter, before you can be any of those things, before you can be the best at anything, you commit to God first. The one who gave you those things to start with, right? And then you take care of your family and your friends and your responsibilities with what God gives you, with the overflow that he gives you. Otherwise, you're going to miss out on complete and full fulfillment in this life. And the first step to this is beginning a relationship with Jesus. If you haven't done that already, it's asking him to come into your life, to forgive you of your sins, and accepting him as your personal Savior. And those of you who have made that step, now the next step is to commit fully to him. Begin developing and building that relationship. Don't wait 6 years like I did. Start now, developing and building that relationship. Will you live your life committed to his will, regardless of the outcomes, so that he can show you things beyond your imagination? I pray that you will make that commitment to God this morning. Let's pray. God, we love you so much. I thank you so much for being so much more than worthy, God. Thank you for knowing us so well that you know exactly what we need, when we need it, long before it ever existed, God. I pray for each person that's in here this morning, God, that you become their first priority, their first commitment in life, God, so that everything else can come from the overflow of that relationship, God. I pray that you help us to be real and honest with ourselves, to understand where we are and what we need to do to begin to make that process real. I pray that you help us to understand what we put before you so that we can draw that back and put you first, God. I pray that you open our eyes to what you can do so that we can trust you to do those things in and through our lives, God. I pray that you make yourself so real in the hearts of every individual in this room and those listening that it's undeniable. God, I pray that you make yourself so real that we can't turn away, we can't avoid you, God, that we have to begin the process of building that relationship and committing completely and fully to you, God.